Warner Brothers moved immediately. Elite lawyers were retained. Studio fixers worked behind the scenes. Witnesses recanted or disappeared. The machinery that protected valuable assets from inconvenient truths operated at full capacity, and it worked. Flynn was acquitted in February 1943, and when the verdict was read, fans outside the courthouse erupted in celebration. He was 33 years old. He had decades ahead of him, and he learned nothing. Private letters, later uncovered and published in 1978, revealed the full architecture of Flynn's private persona. He bragged about his conquests. He mocked the women who had accused him. He spoke about his own celebrity with a contempt that was almost philosophical, as if he had concluded that the world's worship of him was a kind of permission, an agreement between fame and the famous that the ordinary rules of decency simply did not apply. Ron Howard, who studied Flynn's trial and its aftermath carefully while developing his understanding of how power operates in Hollywood, described a specific moment of recognition. Reading about the courtroom behavior, the witnesses who vanished, the fans cheering outside, he said it crystallized something for him. It showed him that the entertainment industry had, at some foundational level, decided that certain men were too valuable to be held accountable, that the price of their talent would be paid by someone else, usually by someone younger, less powerful, and far less protected. Flynn's final years were a slow dismantling. Alcohol consumed him. Cocaine followed. Financial ruin arrived after that. By the late 1950s, the man who had once been the most glamorous figure in Hollywood looked like a cautionary illustration. He died in Vancouver in October 1959, at just 50 years old. The autopsy recorded heart disease, cirrhosis, and severe damage to virtually every organ. He had spent decades treating his body the way he treated the people around him, as if consequences were something that happened to other people. For Howard, Flynn's story was not primarily about scandal. It was about a system that looked at a man behaving monstrously and decided that the box office mattered more than the damage, that a smile on screen could purchase silence about everything that happened off it. Some men, Howard reflected, use fame as a mirror. Flynn used it as a wall, something to hide behind while the real accounting never came. Kirk Douglas spent his entire public life projecting strength, not the effortless, inherited confidence of someone born into privilege, but the hard-earned, almost violent strength of a man who had clawed his way out of poverty and intended to make the world know it. Born Isser Danilovich in 1916 to Russian Jewish immigrant parents in upstate New York, he grew up with almost nothing and turned that deprivation into fuel. By the time Spartacus made him a global icon in 1960, Douglas had remade himself so completely that the boy from Amsterdam, New York, had essentially ceased to exist. What replaced him was formidable, and what lay beneath that formidable surface was something that frightened many of the people who encountered it up close. Crew members who worked with Douglas across his long career described a man of volcanic temperament. His expectations were impossible, and his response to failure was disproportionate and often public. People were reduced to tears on sets he controlled. Assistants who made minor errors faced eruptions that veterans of his productions remembered decades later. The director Stanley Kubrick, who worked with Douglas on Spartacus and Paths of Glory, described him as the most driven man he had ever encountered, and in nearly the same breath noted that he was also the hardest man he had ever tried to direct. There was a quality to Douglas's ambition that went beyond career strategy. It felt personal, consuming. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's performances extensively as a young filmmaker, detected something in his screen presence that he found both magnetic and troubling. There is an anger underneath the performance, Howard observed, not the controlled, character-driven anger of an actor making choices, but something rawer and less directed. Something that seemed to come from a place inside the man that never fully quieted. That something had a history, and that history, as it emerged over decades of testimony from biographers, Hollywood insiders, and people who had been close to the truth for years, was significantly darker than the legend allowed. The most serious allegation attached to Douglas's name concerned actress Natalie Wood, who was 16 years old in 1955 when she encountered him at a party in the Hollywood Hills. The story surfaced in pieces, hinted at by friends, referenced by insiders, and eventually appeared explicitly in the 2018 memoir written by Wood's sister, Lana Wood, who stated directly what had long been whispered, that Douglas had sexually assaulted Natalie Wood when she was a teenager. Douglas faced no charges. The machinery that had protected Errol Flynn a decade earlier was still fully operational, and the circumstances that might have led to an investigation, Natalie Wood's own testimony, a willingness on the part of the industry to take such allegations seriously, simply did not exist in 1955 Hollywood. The story was buried. It would remain buried for decades, surfacing only after Wood's death in 1981 and achieving its fullest public articulation nearly 60 years after the fact. For Howard, the Douglas story represented a particular kind of moral tragedy. Here was a man of genuine achievement, a performer of real power, someone who produced Spartacus and thereby helped break the Hollywood blacklist, who spent decades working and creating and building a legacy. And yet, the question of what that legacy actually rests on, whose suffering helped construct it, whether the admiration extended to him was something he had earned or something he had taken, those questions never received the reckoning they required. When Douglas accepted an honorary Academy Award in 1996, the audience applauded an old man who had survived a stroke and seemed, to casual observers, to have earned some peace. Howard watched and felt something more complicated. The industry was giving a standing ovation to its own silence, to everything it had decided not to say. Kirk Douglas died in February 2020 at the age of 103. His obituaries celebrated his talent, his survival, and his longevity. The other story, Natalie Wood's story, ran in quieter places. For Howard, the contrast said everything about how Hollywood calculates what counts as a legacy. Not every form of Hollywood cruelty involves criminal behavior. Some of it is quieter, more sustained, and in its own way, more insidious, a daily practice of humiliation, control, and contempt that never makes headlines, but leaves wreckage that lasts for years. Faye Dunaway perfected that practice and elevated it into something that the industry, for a long time, chose to interpret as passion. She was, by any measure, a genuine talent. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway arrived in Hollywood with a kind of angular, icy beauty that cinematographers worshipped and the kind of intelligence that directors trusted. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967 announced her as a force. Chinatown in 1974 confirmed it. Network in 1976 won her the Oscar and placed her among the most respected actresses of her generation. For a specific window of time, Faye Dunaway seemed untouchable, and she knew it, and she treated the knowledge as a license. The stories that circulated about her behavior on film sets followed a consistent pattern. Tantrums directed at makeup artists who failed to achieve the precise effect she demanded. Assistants reduced to tears. Directors who arrived at work prepared to solve creative problems and found themselves instead managing an emotional crisis that had nothing to do with the film. The crew members who surrounded her described working in a state of constant low-level dread, never knowing which version of her would appear in the morning, never certain whether today would be productive or catastrophic. Mommy Dearest, the 1981 biographical film in which Dunaway played Joan Crawford, became one of the most commented upon ironies in Hollywood history. Crawford herself had been notorious for cruelty and emotional manipulation. The film was intended as an expose of that cruelty, and Dunaway, by multiple accounts, arrived on set and reproduced the behaviors she had been hired to condemn. Director Frank Perry, who made no secret of his difficulties with her, described a production atmosphere so volatile that he questioned whether the film could be completed. She threw objects. She screamed at crew members who had done nothing wrong. She treated the people around her as obstacles or servants rather than collaborators. What made Dunaway's behavior particularly damaging was its consistency. This was not someone having a bad day or struggling through a difficult production. It was a pattern that repeated across productions, across years, across decades. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, who worked with her for years and understood her capabilities better than almost anyone, eventually said something that seemed to capture the fundamental problem precisely. She didn't just play the difficult woman. She became one, completely and continuously. Ron Howard, who had observed the culture that produced Dunaway and the culture that enabled her, described her as a cautionary example of what happens when an industry confuses fear with respect. When crew members walk on eggshells because a performer has made them afraid, it gets interpreted as deference to genius. The performance becomes untouchable because everyone around it is too frightened to say what they actually see. The talent is real, but the talent gets used as justification for everything that surrounds it. And eventually, the justifications run out. By the 2000s, the calls stopped coming. Directors who had heard the stories, and in Hollywood, the stories circulate completely and efficiently, regardless of what appears in print, declined to take the risk. The industry that had once competed for her services quietly closed its doors. In 2011, when she was fired from a Broadway production of Tea at 5 during previews, the incident became public, and the reporting made clear that the decision had been made by people who had experienced her behavior directly and had concluded that the creative upside was insufficient to justify the cost. For Howard, Dunaway's trajectory illustrated something specific about the relationship between cruelty and longevity. Talent can carry a person for years. It can purchase an extraordinary amount of tolerance. But a career is ultimately a collaborative enterprise, and a person who is unwilling or unable to treat collaborators with basic human dignity will eventually find themselves without collaborators. The spotlight doesn't protect you forever. At some point, the people who have to work with you every day decide that no performance is worth what it costs to obtain it. She chased an impossible standard, Howard reflected, and in chasing it, she forgot that the people around her were human beings, not furniture. That forgetfulness has a price. There are figures in Hollywood history so thoroughly transformed into symbol that it becomes almost impossible to discuss the actual human being behind the image. John Wayne is the most extreme example of this phenomenon in American entertainment history. He did not merely become famous. He became an argument about manhood, about patriotism, about what it meant to be American. And he used that argument to exempt himself from scrutiny in ways that shaped and damaged the industry around him for decades. He was born Marion Morrison in Winterset, Iowa in 1907, a detail that he buried so thoroughly that mentioning it feels almost transgressive. The name Wayne came from a publicist. The walk came from coaching. The philosophy, the hard, unyielding, specifically masculine worldview that he deployed in interviews and on film sets, and in his own self-conception, came from a man who had never served in combat, who had actively avoided military service during the Second World War, while films like The Sands of Iwo Jima made him the visual embodiment of American military valor. Ron Howard, who grew up watching Wayne on television, and who studied him carefully as a young filmmaker learning to understand the relationship between performance and power, described a specific moment of disillusionment. It came not from a single incident, but from an accumulation, a gradual recognition that the character Wayne projected and the man who projected it were separated by a moral gulf that the industry had conspired to ignore. On film sets, Wayne ruled through intimidation. He was physically imposing and temperamentally certain, and he used both qualities to ensure that people around him remained deferential or became invisible. Technicians who failed to meet his standards were publicly humiliated. People who disagreed with him were dismissed, often before the conversation was finished. His longtime collaborator and sometime adversary, director John Ford, was one of the few people who pushed back with any consistency, and even Ford ultimately accommodated more of Wayne's demands than was probably good for the films they made together. The racial dimension of Wayne's worldview was not a secret during his lifetime. It was visible in how he spoke about indigenous performers on Western sets, in how he treated black actors who were beginning, during the 1960s, to push back against the stereotypes that Hollywood had assigned them. It was most visible in the 1971 Playboy interview, a document so nakedly revealing of Wayne's actual beliefs that subsequent generations, encountering it, have struggled to reconcile it with the mythology that still surrounds him. In that interview, Wayne made statements about Native Americans that were contemptible, expressed doubt about Black Americans' readiness for self-governance, and characterized an entire generation of cultural change as weakness. The statements were not the product of a bad day or a misquoted sentence. They were coherent, extended, and clearly long-held. Howard studied Wayne's performance in The Searchers, the 1956 John Ford film in which Wayne plays Ethan Edwards, a Confederate veteran consumed by racial hatred, with a specific kind of attention. The character, as Ford conceived him, was meant to be a portrait of moral failure, a man whose hatreds ultimately isolate him from the community he protects. Ford intended critical distance. Wayne seemed to resist it, playing Edwards with a sympathy that complicated the film's moral architecture in ways that Howard found both fascinating and disturbing. You couldn't always be certain, watching the performance, where the character's worldview ended and the actor's began. The anger felt too real. The contempt felt too comfortable. John Wayne died in June 1979 of stomach cancer, and the nation mourned him as it mourned symbols, with a kind of grief that has more to do with what the symbol represents than with the actual person being memorialized. The myth survived and continues to survive, as myths do, by maintaining a careful distance from inconvenient specifics. For Howard, Wayne's story was a warning about the relationship between power and accountability. A man sufficiently certain of his own rightness, surrounded by an industry willing to indulge that certainty because it was profitable, can spend an entire career behaving in ways that cause real harm and receive nothing but applause. The harm doesn't stop being harm because the person causing it believes in what they're doing. The bully convinced of his own virtue is still a bully. He's just harder to name. The Roman Polanski question is, in some ways, the most difficult one that Hollywood has ever been asked, and the industry's response to it over nearly 50 years has revealed something fundamental and uncomfortable about how the entertainment world values certain things against other things. It has revealed that, under the right circumstances, the industry will choose genius over justice. It will choose the work over the person the work harmed, and it will perform that choice publicly with applause, while the person who was harmed watches from wherever she has had to make her life. Ron Howard has spoken about Polanski with more explicit care than he has brought to other subjects, because the complexity of the case is real even when the moral question at its center is not. The moral question is simple. A 13-year-old girl was sexually assaulted. The man who assaulted her pleaded guilty. He then fled before sentencing, and has spent nearly 5 decades living in Europe beyond the reach of American law. Everything else, the debate about his films, the question of artistic legacy, the 2003 Oscar, the standing ovation, is the industry's attempt to make the simple question complicated. Polanski was born in Paris in 1933 and survived the Nazi occupation of Poland in childhood circumstances of extraordinary horror. His mother died at Auschwitz. He was separated from his father and lived on the streets of Krakow, surviving through a combination of luck and the kindness of strangers. The darkness that runs through his films, the paranoia, the claustrophobia, the sense of a world that turns against the vulnerable without warning, is rooted in experiences that very few filmmakers have actually lived. Knife in the Water, Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown. These are films of genuine artistic power, and refusing to acknowledge that power is not honesty. It is a different kind of evasion. But artistic power does not create moral immunity. This is the point that Hollywood spent decades refusing to accept. In March 1977, at a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's home in Los Angeles, Polanski sexually assaulted Samantha Geimer, who was 13 years old. He was 43. The evidence was overwhelming and uncontested. He pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. Before sentencing could be completed, he boarded a plane to France and never came back. The industry's response in the years that followed was a study in moral compartmentalization. There were those who condemned him without qualification. But there are also those directors, actors, studio executives who signed petitions seeking his release, attended retrospectives of his work, and eventually, in 2003, gave him the Academy Award for Best Director for The Pianist. The film, about the survival of a Jewish pianist during the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, was received with a standing ovation by an audience most of whom understood exactly what they were doing. Ron Howard did not stand. He has spoken about that moment in terms that make clear what he was thinking about. Not the film, not the craft. A 13-year-old girl and the sound that applause must make when heard from a distance of 26 years. Howard's critique of the Polanski case is not primarily about Polanski. It is about the industry's capacity for self-deception. The willingness to construct elaborate frameworks about context, about artistic importance, about the complexity of genius, that allow people who know better to do something they know is wrong and feel, afterward, that they have behaved with nuance rather than cowardice. The sophistication of the rationalization does not change what the rationalization is protecting. Samantha Geimer, who went on to have a life and a family and who has spoken publicly about the case multiple times over the decades, has asked that people stop treating her assault as primarily a story about Roman Polanski's career. That the request has been so consistently ignored, that the debate continues to center on the filmmaker rather than on the person the filmmaker harmed, is itself the answer to every question about what Hollywood's priorities actually are. He can frame a shot, Howard said once. That is real, and it changes nothing. The last story is in some ways the strangest, because Mickey Rooney's sins were not the sins of violence or assault or ideological cruelty, but the sins of a man who consumed everything around him and left almost nothing intact, including himself. He was Hollywood's first genuine child superstar, and the system that created him produced damage that radiated outward for the rest of his very long life. He was born Joseph Yule Jr. in Brooklyn in 1920, the son of vaudeville performers who put him on stage before he could properly read. By the time he was a teenager, MGM had turned him into one of the most famous human beings on earth. The Andy Hardy films, the musicals with Judy Garland, the boundless, almost frantic energy that he brought to every performance, and that made audiences feel, watching him, that they were in the presence of something inexhaustible. He was the all-American boy made cinematic, cheerful, scrappy, endlessly capable. The reality behind the cheerfulness was considerably darker. MGM treated child performers in the 1930s and 1940s with a combination of intense attention and profound negligence that produced predictable results. The attention was commercial, protecting the investment, managing the image, ensuring the product remained deliverable. The negligence was emotional, a near total absence of anything resembling genuine care for the developing human beings who were generating the studio's profits. Rooney, like Judy Garland, like the other young performers who were cycled through the studio system during those decades, was given stimulants to keep his energy up and sedatives to bring him down, was kept on restrictive diets and impossible schedules, and was provided essentially no structure for understanding how to exist as a person rather than as a product. What emerged from that system was a man of enormous charm and almost no capacity for the kind of sustained, genuine attention to other people that healthy relationships require. Rooney married 8 times. He was unfaithful in virtually all of those marriages. He gambled compulsively, losing fortunes that he earned and re-earned throughout a career that kept extending itself, through his own talent and through an industry that genuinely couldn't figure out what to do with him, well into old age. His relationship with Judy Garland deserves particular attention, because Garland's suffering has been extensively documented and because Rooney occupied an unusual position in her life. They were close, genuinely, deeply close, in the way that people who survive shared ordeals develop bonds that outlast circumstances. But Garland, in private conversations that were documented by people close to her, suggested that Rooney was not simply a fellow survivor. He was, at times, an active participant in the culture of cruelty that surrounded her. Not in the way the studio executives were, but present in it, part of it. The difficulty with Rooney is that the damage he caused was often inseparable from the damage he experienced. He was, in some meaningful sense, a person who had been broken by the system that created him and who subsequently broke others in ways that reflected his own fractures. That does not excuse anything, but it complicates the moral accounting in ways that the cleaner stories of Flynn or Wayne do not. By the time he reached old age, Rooney had outlived every version of himself. The child star, the troubled adult, the celebrity has been, the elder statesman of old Hollywood who appeared at retrospectives and award shows as a living connection to an era most of the audience had only read about. He had also, by the final years of his life, been subjected to a form of financial exploitation by members of his own extended household that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the exploitation he had experienced at the hands of MGM 7 decades earlier. The court proceedings that emerged from that situation painted a portrait of a very old man, isolated and confused, being drained by the people he trusted. He died in April 2014 at the age of 93. His estate was valued at less than $20,000. His body was initially unclaimed. Ron Howard, reflecting on Rooney's story, arrived at something more painful than condemnation. He saw in Rooney's life a portrait of what Hollywood's machinery actually produces when it operates without conscience, not just harm to those outside the system, but a kind of corrosion that works inward, that destroys the person at the center of the machinery along with everyone who gets too close. He made the world feel good, Howard said once, while carrying something that hollowed him out from inside. The smile wasn't a lie, exactly, but it was a performance. And the performance never stopped. Not once in 70 years. Ron Howard has never claimed that these stories are pleasant to tell. He has never positioned himself as a crusader or suggested that naming the past is sufficient to correct it. He is too careful a thinker for that, and too honest about the complexity of the institution he has spent his life inside. What he has said repeatedly in different contexts, in different words, is that silence is a choice. That the golden age of Hollywood produced not just art, but harm, and that pretending otherwise is a way of continuing the harm in a different form. The studio system that silenced Peggy Satterlee, that buried Natalie Wood's story, that gave Roman Polanski a standing ovation 26 years after he fled justice. That system did not operate without individual choices made by individual people who decided that something was worth more than accountability. Talent, box office, cultural mythology, the idea of an era. These were the things that got weighed against the cost and came out ahead, again and again, across decades. The most dangerous belief in Hollywood, Howard has reflected, is the belief that the work justifies the person. That if the film is great enough, the man who made it earns a kind of retroactive pardon for everything he was off the set. That belief did not protect the people who were harmed. It protected the people who did the harming. And it left a legacy that is built, in part, on the silence of those who deserve to be heard. The golden age glitters. It was always meant to. But underneath the glitter, if you're willing to look, the foundation is something much less beautiful. 6 names, 6 stories, and one industry that spent decades deciding they were all worth the price.